You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injuries and additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
Get ready for Netflix's gripping new medical drama, Pulse. Set in a cutting-edge Miami trauma center, third-year resident Dr. Danny Sims is unexpectedly thrust into a promotion when beloved chief resident Dr. Xander Phillips gets suspended. Then, with the emotional and physical stakes at their highest, a storm will push the hospital and its residents to their limits. Witness how life can change in a heartbeat when you're operating under pressure. Watch Pulse, only on Netflix.
Well, Chris Spangle Show, thanks for joining me today. A little bit of a weird one production-wise. I got locked out of my house, so I'm actually recording this interview from my front porch. Promise you it sounds good. Thankfully, AI has some reprocessing tools that makes it much more audible. But that's why it looks weird. I'm in my house now, so this is my office. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see my bookshelf behind me with all my trinkets and books and everything. We're talking about immigration today. So Cruz Garcia is an independent policy consultant based in Southern California. Master's degree from Pepperdine, a School of Public Policy, bachelor's from University of Michigan. Incredibly smart guy. And he wrote an article in Real Clear Politics called "While Trump Deports Undocumented Immigrants, Latino Voters Are Optimistic." And the crux of his argument is trying to explain why a lot of Latino voters are supportive of Trump, as the Latino voting base has shifted more rightward. He gives some explanation to that using his family history, which was really interesting. And you'll hear him go into, the background of his grandparents who were undocumented immigrants, and grandpa eventually ended up in jail because of a lot of that. And I thought that was fascinating. I don't agree with a lot of his article and a lot of this interview. And I don't want to taint it, right? I want to give you my opinion. I tend to look at a lot of the support for Trump as we've got to do something, and at least he's offering to do something, whereas Democrats are offering to do nothing. And obviously, what you hear in this interview, what you hear in some of the other interviews I've done lately around this topic, is a frustration with Democrats and their lack of policies, or their policies, like catch and release criminals that lead to deaths like Laken Riley's. Those aren't options. That's not what voters are looking for. Latino voters are especially impacted by crime related to immigration, connected to immigration. And often their communities are the hardest hit because police can't operate in those communities as well as they can in others, because there's not as much cooperation because of ICE and undocumented. And what I'd like to see is not this further. I mean, look, I talk about this in the interview with him. I'm like, the dehumanizing language. I think the first term was when Trump was using dehumanizing language about immigrants. I think we're seeing dehumanizing policies on a scale that are much more pronounced. They're starting to put into action a lot of the dehumanizing language. So I think it's a fool's errand to trust the Trump administration that they're going to just stop with Venezuelan gangs. And we discussed that. We bring that up. And I think I don't know if I mentioned it in the interview or if we were talking in the after interview, but America has to start coming up with an immigration policy that actually makes sense, that actually works. Just putting a complete stop to it, no immigration, unless it's from a country that we like, then that's not a workable policy. Neither is Biden's policy of do whatever you want. We're just going to kind of look the other way. So I thought Bush's immigration policies back in the mid 2000s were really solid. And I almost got impeached as chair of the College Republicans chapter that I was head of because I said that. So I read a book last year, kind of speaking of that Bush immigration policy, because that really was a bellwether moment for Republicans in immigration. When things started to change, Trump is credited with bringing immigration back into the mainstream conversation in the mid 2010s. But having been a talk radio screener from 2004 to 2008, it was always on the forefront of the minds of conservative America, especially. Brian Rosenwald wrote a book called Talk Radio's America, how an industry took over a political party that took over the United States. I think this was an outstanding book. It's not unfair. It's not some liberal leftist talk, saying, oh, look how bad these people are. It's really an honest history of the industry that has been very impactful. And immigration is key to the success of talk radio. Talk radio on the right seeded the ground for where we're at and why Donald Trump's singular focus on immigration is so popular in a lot of quarters of America. So I'd highly recommend the book, Talk Radio's America. Really easy and fun read. Audiobook is good too. So check that out. But I think that's why for conservatives, it has become such this is just, there's no conversation about it. It's because we've had 30 years of conversation on the right that is somewhat misinformed, fairly dehumanized, and why there's such an urgency to get something done. So check that book out. And they talk about the 2006, where Bush comes in and basically comes up with like a plan to allow people to come here and work and not gain citizenship unless it's through a long protracted process that vets people properly. And that was just a non-starter back then. So yeah, I'm sort of meandering here. So let me get to Cruz. Cruz was a great guest, very thoughtful, and I think you'll enjoy the conversation. I'd love to hear from you. Let me know what you think about this conversation at chris@chrisspangle.com, and we'll review your letters in a future episode. All right, so thanks. We'll see you soon. Here's Cruz. Well, it's great to talk to you because your article is indicative of what is confusing a lot of people outside of the Hispanic community. Why has there been a large shift in Latino votes towards Donald Trump when seemingly a lot of his policies are, at anti-Hispanic, anti-Latino, anti-immigration? I'm not sure how you would put it. It probably just depends on your political worldview. Let's start with your background, because you wrote this article in Real Clear Politics called "While Trump Deports Undocumented Immigrants, Latino Voters Are Optimistic." And you share a little bit about your background and your view of immigration control. So let's start with why this is personal to you. Tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, so this is something that's very close to home to me. I am from Saginaw, Michigan, a blue collar Midwestern town that was pretty vibrant during the automotive era, where a lot of people flocked to places like Detroit and Flint and Saginaw. And once my grandparents, migrated to this country illegally, they made a plight to Michigan, where it was safe, where they could reach the benefits. But obviously, being an undocumented immigrant comes with a lot of different hurdles. And my grandfather succumbed to the vices of a developing small Midwestern town. As we know, the jobs that were once really available in places like Saginaw in Michigan, they went overseas, and it left the community in detriment. And my grandfather being undocumented, he got caught up in the law. I mean, and there's a lot that I don't know as a grandkid, because for most of my life he was imprisoned, and I like to think the best about some of the things that he did. I do know that he got saved in prison. He became a Christian. So he did denounce, the things that he did. But for most of my life, it was, seeing him on the run, him being a targeted criminal and an immigrant. I often wonder if he would be a part of, the group that would get sent to El Salvador had he been, brought up during this time. So all that to say is that
Is that their country of origin? Was it El Salvador?
no, I'm of Mexican origin. So they were a part of the wave of immigrants that came in the 70s. So yeah, but for most of my life, I grew up with with the idea that law enforcement, immigration, was completely against people that shared my skin color. Having young parents, they antagonized the police very often until they've matured into parents that have experience, and then started to encourage me to also consider conservative values. So I was brought up to see that transition into more traditional or conservative values because of the environment that we were in. But it did come from.
If I can pause there, that's something that has always confused me about the conservative immigration stance. Is like, why would conservatives be against a lot of conservative, pro-family, pro-life, Catholic, entrepreneurial immigrants coming to America and wanting to make it harder? And I think what you just outlined is so in line with kind of what I've always thought is like, you're not importing. When you have immigration, you're bringing in people who could align probably more with conservatives and how they want to live their life than maybe your average progressive person.
Exactly. And it does. I do find myself in a sticky situation defending Trump's immigration approach to immigration, because I mean, when you read my article, I do sound MAGA, but I'm actually not. I highlight the fact that he distinguishes violent offenders to Latinos who've assimilated into American society, who are immigrants but have legal status. And unfortunately, that does in when it comes to policies, there are injustices, and that does bring in peaceful immigrants who may have undocumented status, but they still might be peaceful. They might be accused of something under the Lake and Riley Act, where they might have to be in detention. But when it comes to protecting the Latino community overall, there is an issue with public safety. And when you look at polls from like Pew and I believe Gallup, they have all shown that Latinos prioritize public safety over race-related issues like immigration. So, I'm not, super in favor of a hard-nosed approach to immigration, but I'm not gonna, as a researcher, I'm not going to ignore that Latinos are becoming more conservative. They are prioritizing public safety, and if that means favoring Trump's stringent approach to immigration, then that's what they're going to prioritize. At the same time, I was talking about my family coming from a background where crime was involved. There were churches in Saginaw, in the inner city, specifically Pentecostal churches that would have revivals and that would outreach to community members. And that's how my grandparents became, my grandmother and on both sides actually became involved with the church, and kind of had a worldview shift, to look at American politics in a Judeo-Christian sense. So I think it's underestimated what churches do in low-income communities. There a lot of Christian churches, they're not boastful, but when you are brought up in a community that is distressed economically, you do notice the grassroots outreach and the impact that it has.
Yeah, it is by and large churches and Christians that are not on TikTok and Instagram flashing what they're doing and wearing $5,000 sneakers that are feeding the poor and help. I mean, I at work just did a video for the Indiana Lawyer. I work at a news outlet, and we featured the neighborhood Christian legal clinic. And a big chunk of what this organization does is no cost legal work for immigrants, because the Christian community here believes in helping go against Leviathan with at least some aid, because it's so difficult to navigate the system. That's where I think you and I read your article, and I think we probably, I don't know where we agree or disagree. You seem far more pro Trump immigration's policies than I am. I'd like to see something a lot more rational. But that's why I was curious in talking to you, because I think you're bringing a perspective obviously I don't have. Let's talk about those disagreements later, because I want to continue down the road of your article, because that's why you're here, is to talk a little bit about that. But you talk about the Laken-Riley Act and why that's getting a lot of bipartisan support. It got a lot of Democrats in the House and the Senate voted for it. What was the Laken-Riley Act, and why do you think that this started to gain support in Latino communities?
Yeah, well, the Laken-Riley Act was an executive order pushed by Trump that went after undocumented immigrants who were accused of theft or violent acts. It would supposedly would have prevented a situation like what has been done to Laken-Riley, who was murdered and raped by an illegal immigrant from Venezuela, who had multiple instances with ICE and being accused of different crimes. So that bill was intended to go after people like that. As a researcher and as somebody who has libertarian values, I definitely understand the pros and cons that come with a bill like that. Specifically, people like me who look like me could be targeted. And that is, a trade-off that a lot of people in the Latino community are coming to terms with. And I will tell you that it's mainly because we see the crime that goes on in these inner city communities. When it comes to undocumented people, it creates a rabbit hole of investigative problems, judicial problems, crimes going unsolved, investigations still being pended because it's extremely hard to track undocumented people. Just from the city that I'm from, I mean, we don't have a large Latino community, but I had a classmate, just a few years ago, she was murdered and she was pregnant, and her baby fortunately survived. Her name is Laura Buendia. And, it's instances like that are so close to home where you realize that there's more danger to being lumped with immigration group that is different from the early 2000s, in the sense that ICE reported that it's mainly men under the age of 30 that are coming from countries outside of Mexico and Latin America. I believe 50% are coming from countries like Haiti and Venezuela and China. So it's a different demographic in that sense. And Latinos who are holding conservative values, Judeo-Christian ones, are prioritizing public safety, protecting their family. They see themselves in Laken-Riley, but even more specifically in Jocelyn Lungere, who was also murdered by an illegal immigrant who happened to share the same skin color as him. And while I'm also very critical of Trump, especially in regard to the 14th Amendment, I think Agustina Vergara, who you had on previously, I think she had a really good explanation of it. And, she is an expert in which I wouldn't say I'm an expert in immigration. But, Trump, I will say that Trump does do a few things good, in the sense that he distinguishes, violent criminals from law-abiding Latinos that, have, who aspire to achieve the American dream. I mean, I think it was such a beautiful thing when he named the Wildlife Center after Jocelyn Lungere and honored her, the mother during his one of his first speeches before Congress. So, in regard to combating violence in the inner city and implementing law and order, or cultivating it. Um, I think that's a positive thing that can be taken from the Laken Riley Act.
Yeah, so here's where I want to push back a little bit, because I just love for you to explain it to me, not to have an argument or debate or anything, just your point of view, because I look at, as a libertarian, I see other libertarians supporting Trump over 50% of their, like, like if I'm pushed a little more into that camp than other, right? I look at it like, man, you're getting fooled again. Like, Donald Trump was not great for the economy the first time around. He's why we had the inflationary policies of the COVID outbreak, wrote 3 stimulus bills. I look at his immigration policies and I just sort of wonder why people think that it stops with the violent criminals, when he is so over the top with his rhetoric and dehumanizing many different communities. I mean, let's just face a lot of non-white communities. It doesn't really matter what it is. He doesn't have any problem with dehumanizing language. And I'm concerned that when you use that kind of dehumanizing language over and over and over for a decade, that once you get the ball rolling in a certain direction, it's really hard to stop those directions. So we start at the Venezuelan gangs, and everybody with a brain and a heart goes, I don't want Venezuelan gangs in my country. I don't want these violent criminals in the communities that you're talking about to be a part of it. But then all of a sudden it starts to get into, well, naturalized citizenship is on the table. Birthright citizenship is on the table. That's where I look at it as a libertarian and go, all right, maybe we're heading in a direction that is anti-immigrant that we can't rein in once we go down that path. What do you think about that? Feel free to be rude. I don't care if you go, this guy's an ignorant person. But I just look at what is kind of creeping in with doctors coming in that should be able to work and live here, and naturalized citizens like the Iranian doctor in the first term that they denaturalized him for really no good reason. That's not a path that I want to go down.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I'm not super supportive of Trump's approach to immigration. In regard to it's reported that has such a broader brush or broader scope of who he's considering to be undocumented. But there's also evidence that, there's current data, ICE reports that show that he's still not on Biden and Obama level with regard to immigration. And as somebody, I mean, again, I'm not an immigration expert. I do look at policy interest from different demographics, and how certain policies are played out. And I think the libertarian approach doesn't take into consideration the different wave of immigrants that is currently infiltrating these communities, and the fact that local governments and states have provided them funding and have really kind of incentivized them to actually cause harm. I mean, when you can't work, you're giving stipends from local governments. Something does have to be done, and it was community members speaking out. I mean, if you look at a Chicago City Council, you have Black residents who are feeling left out of the conversation, who are also having struggles within their communities. Latinos, even in Chicago and places like Los Angeles, having issues within their communities, and then finding migrant groups that they didn't vote for. A lot of these cities did it through city council vote, and they're expressing themselves. So, and also with so much social media, so many outlets of information, it's kind of hard to ignore the public cry. And as a libertarian, I'm somebody who's all for local community, responding to constituents. I'm not, super conservative, but when I go to city council meetings for different cities in Los Angeles, whether it be South El Monte, uh, San Bernardino, Riverside, those are mostly Latino constituents, and elders of the community are coming out and saying that they don't want cannabis in their community. They don't want homeless encampments. That they want their traditional culture preserved. As an American and as somebody who wants to advance liberty, I mean, I can't pull out my libertarian economic model and say, but they can be potentially, valuable in the labor market, which I honestly don't really know if that's the case, because, the immigration waves in the early 2000s, they were looking for work. They had aspirations for the American dream, coming from Mexico, where it's a developing country, not a rogue country, where, which can lead to a better chance of prosperity, if you ask me, compared to, immigrant groups that are strategically, uh, brought to the U.S. by rogue regimes. And whether that's true or not, I mean, the demographic is enough to be alarmed, I would say.
Yeah, I have an interview that I haven't posted yet, but it's actually the next episode. So it is with, because I think if you enjoy this episode, you'll enjoy that episode. Gabby Blanco. Gabby is she came from Cuba in the last few years, and she's fairly pro-Trump on immigration. And we had a similar conversation. And what I got from her was like, I'm reflexively anti-leftist because of growing up in a communist country. Is there a bit of this that is having lived in, I live in a progressive area. I've had stuff stolen from my house, and the prosecutor isn't going to do a darn thing about it. The people that stole my stuff came from another county, a donut county. A couple of rednecks came in and stole stuff because they know if they get caught here, they're not going to go to jail, because the prosecutor isn't going to do anything about it. The prosecutor and the police generally just now are starting to crack down on things like vagrancy and certain things that reduce the quality of life in a downtown area where I live and work. I have a far higher tolerance of like homeless people than my brother, who stopped by the city yesterday and was like, oh my goodness. Right. But is there some of this that is just, I'm supporting Trump because I'm so tired of progressive policies that are not working, that are making my life more dangerous, that are ruining the place that I live and making my life harder?
Oh, certainly, if she's, anywhere near my age, I'm 26. We were, really influenced by from like, the Obama era to the transition to the Trump era. If you just, voiced an opinion of opposition on a liberal campus, you're ostracized, especially if you are brown or black, because, those communities become very insular in, predominantly white institutions. So I can say I was very much influenced by that, but at the same time, I have been in extreme left environments and somewhat extreme right environments. And I have a section in my piece where I say it's important to have bipartisan efforts because it does bring both sides to the conversation. Um, I I try hard to separate Trump from his supporters. I think it's you know can be very dangerous for him to not address some of the rhetoric that he portrays. I do refer to instances where he spoke to Latino communities like that, where he told told us they're not like you, which in a sense I could honestly relate to, because having a family that is has a background in crime, I do understand that there is a immigrant community that is not law abiding, that does want to come here to get into the illicit market. And it's dangerous for already distressed communities. But I want to also be a rational voice that says, hey, you rushing the gun on on issues like the 14th Amendment, that set a precedent for so many immigrants that it just I'm a believer in the sense that you have to speak somebody's language in order to be a part of the conversation. And in that sense, I did, I did praise Trump in order to reel the conversation in and shed light on, let's not make this a Republican victory, but let's make it a bipartisan one. Both sides need to be at the table for reform.
I like that. I mean, I think it's absolutely true. I think Democrats have gone so far out of the mainstream on so many issues, but immigration being one, that you accidentally start advocating for Venezuelan gang members, like instead of hardworking communities and hardworking Americans. Yeah, and Republicans, it's sort of the social mediaification of our conversations. I was having a conversation today where, like, if you were having a conversation in the newsroom where I work, it would be far different than the conversation that's happening on Twitter. They don't even resemble each other. So that's where I wanted to ask you about, and I'm going to butcher this. I took 12 semesters of Spanish and I know like 4 words, so I apologize. But Tren de Aragua, first, who are they? And then do you have a sense of, like, on the ground, give me, what I liked about your piece is that it gave me a sense of what, it put me inside your family, right? It put me inside of your experience, which I want to understand your perspective. Like you said, you can't have a conversation if you're not speaking the same languages. I'm paraphrasing. But, sometimes I look at the Fox News stuff and I'm just like, did a Venezuelan gang take over a city? Like, is this just propaganda to get me to go along with your side? How do we, when we're watching media, how do we parse the propaganda versus the real lived experiences of people like your family when it comes to, like, Tren de Aragua and the gangs and the violence that you're talking about?
Yeah, as a researcher, I'm humbled a lot by data and the things that aren't taken into consideration. And sometimes it's when it comes to certain policy, it starts with, like, reducing it to the bones and just recognizing that, the being undocumented is unfortunate because, you're subjected to the immigration process that is extremely complicated. So that alone presents so many different problems. And then on top of that, you have, a different demographic. 50% are coming from countries that we've never experienced immigration waves at this length with. And then you combine that with city council, they're all live streamed. You can see people complaining, people fact checked what Haitians were doing to animals when Trump brought it up during the debate. And there was actually, like, a debate on Twitter as to whether or not that was true. And to me, it's an instance like that could easily be debunked if there wasn't so many reports of different things going on with, migrants. I mean, and, when a lot of these, I don't know the specifics, but all this to say is that gathering, concrete data and research on these groups is already hard as it is. So there is kind of a necessity to rely on testimonies from, people at city council meetings and from what is reported on social media. I mean, I would tell, I would be very cautious of, like, dates and, when things happen, because, you can go down rabbit holes of looking at, violent acts by, immigrants from years ago. But, I just think that it's becoming much harder to debunk a crisis when it's so, like, when there's multiple avenues of ways to report, instances of crime uncertainties from community members. I know I went to a city council meeting in South El Monte, and this elderly woman, she was saying that this was her 3rd time or like 2nd time speaking to city council about a man who she believed was a migrant who would, just stare at her while she did, garden work. So, whether those instances are true or not, community members are concerned. So I think my overall thing is that, I want communities like mine to be protected. And it does sometimes come at the cost, law enforcement does unfortunately come at the cost of profiling and injustice. Humans are not perfect, and where a justice is given somewhere, a so-called injustice is placed elsewhere. Oh, I think you're
Sorry,
right.
I'm muted. I am doing this podcast outside because I'm locked out of my own house. I'm sure there are questions that I should ask that I don't know to ask. So I just want to give you a chance to kind of, what else would you like to say on this topic that people need to know that maybe we didn't cover, and then tell people how they can follow you.
Yeah, as I said before, I am somebody who is offering the perspective. I am an outsider to the immigration policy conversation. I am connected with it because of my family, but I think it takes a really strong team of experts and people who have valuable perspectives to come up with proper reform. I am simply a voice that wants to shed light on the importance of prioritizing public safety, but also recognizing that there's a rational way to go about it in regard to evidence-based research and looking at policies in the past that have been successful, looking at immigrant groups that have found success in assimilation. Those are all important considerations to be made when it comes to policy. And I, like, as Chris said, I am somebody who was heavily influenced by progressive ideas being kind of pushed on me in my college upbringing. So I do push back on a lot of those, but I'm also, conscious that, cognizant that, the pendulum can swing far the other way. So if you're interested in more of my writing, my Substack is The Enlightened under Cruz Garcia. And I just would like to thank you, Chris, for having me on the show. And it's always a joy to add to the policy conversation in regard to immigration.
Well, thanks so much for being on. I really appreciate the conversation. It was great talking to you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for watching here on the Chris Spangle Show. If you learned something, if you got something out of it, please share on social media. That's the best way to help any podcast that you like grow. And we will see you again next week here on the Chris Spangle Show.